All right, friends, we made it to the end of these 4 rapid fire talks. This is the last one, and then I'm going to get you guys out of here. I love that Pastor Chris earlier started with Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47. Just this picture. I think it's, as we're thinking about, as we're considering what a gospel community is, it very much fits the picture. It helps us understand what we're driving at. And so the more you guys meditate and reflect and think about that as individuals and within the context of your gospel community, the more you're going to lock in. What are we about? What are we aiming for? And so for this particular talk, when we're talking about missional momentum, I want to look at the very last part of chapter 2, verse 47. That phrase, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. This is what we mean when we talk about a value of missional momentum. Here's what we say in your GC guidebook. The movement to disciple others, to invite others in, to help others grow and mature, that's what we refer to as missional momentum. Every gospel community seeks to grow in both size and spiritual depth. And so people have been using this language, a healthy GC will. So a healthy GC will grow in depth, a sense of spiritual maturity, and a healthy GC will grow in size, meaning new people will be coming in. Now, to some degree, growing in spiritual maturity plays out in how we disciple one another. It's very, as we think about shared ownership, it's very important that we step into, it's not just the leaders who are discipling people in a gospel community. Everyone is taking ownership of everyone else. We're seeking to make disciples of one another, how we have follow-up conversations, how we open up the Bible together and teach one another how to read scripture or how to pray. Now, I'd love to talk more about how we grow in spiritual depth, but we're covering that in other ways. During these 10 minutes, I want to primarily focus on how we grow in size. Because when a community is centered on Christ, we will want to share it with others to the point that it swells, to the point that it gets bigger. You need to know that as a participant, your community, it is not simply structured to care for you or care for your family. In the section of your guidebook describing what a gospel community is, we also provide some bullets of what a gospel community is not. And one of them says this: a gospel community is not a care group. While individuals of a gospel community will care for one another, a gospel community is not a support group. The members of a gospel community, they gather to grow as disciples, and I'll add, make disciples of others. If you don't want your gospel community to grow in size, this is going to create some tension. Okay, let's talk about that tension. Now, when your community is centered on Christ, you're going to be compelled to share it with others to the point that it will swell. In the book Groups, that one that we gave to Skip and Laura, the authors say this: mission drift occurs, and the goal of making disciples gets pushed aside while the group just hangs out, right? If we're just trying to hang out, if we're just trying to care for one another, that group is going to become stagnant. That group is going to experience mission drift. A group centered on simply caring for one another, while there is some benefit, it is not so much centered on Christ. It is not centered on the mission of making disciples. A community centered on Christ, it cannot help when it's centered on Christ, but long to share the gospel with others. It can't help but long to see friends and family and coworkers invited in, so it will swell. Now, how do we imagine this happens within a gospel community at First City Church? I want to give you 3 pictures. I learned through illustrations. They kind of connect with me, and so I want to share 2 of kind of these aren't quite it, and then one that gets more about what we're after. And I love stick figures, so expect stick figure illustrations. Okay, illustration number 1, we're going to call this a gathering of missionaries. This is a view of community where people, they're sent out individually to make disciples of others. And then they come together regularly for fellowship, encouragement, and to equip one another. Every person is on an individual mission. Maybe you're on mission in a particular workplace or a particular neighborhood or a particular group of parents or connected to your kids' school. You want to share the gospel with these individuals. Maybe even seek out opportunities to invite them into your gathering. But you all are individually responsible for being on mission to a particular people. There is only crossover when those people enter a common gathering place. Okay, there can be some beautiful things that happen here. But in many ways, this falls short of what we want. All right, illustration number 2. Some people call this a missional community. This is a group of people. They have one shared mission. Maybe military members, maybe people who live in my neighborhood, the Sunrise neighborhood. We actually tried missional communities during my time at Coram Deo. And there was actually one composed of people from First City. Mitch and Steph Jackson were part of this. And I think they did it best. Their mission was to share the gospel with people at a place called the Game Shop. They were committed to making disciples of one particular people. Now, there can be some beautiful things that happen here. Stories of mission, stories of together engaging people who are not part of a church or are not disciples of Jesus. But even if there's some cool things happening here and things are growing, moving forward, each of these people have a life outside of that specific mission. Like maybe they live in a different neighborhood, or they work for different companies. And when that's true, which it always is, their love for the gospel is going to compel them to make disciples of people who are beyond that shared mission. And so in describing what a gospel community is, we say a gospel community is not a missional community. While gospel communities are committed to the mission of making disciples, so they're on mission, a shared mission is not what ultimately unites them. Chuck talked about that. The people are bound together by the gospel of Jesus Christ. They won't want to restrict their mission to one particular people group. So while there can be some beautiful things with a missional community, again, in many ways, it falls short of what we want. Okay, so illustration number 3. We'll call this third illustration a missionary family. This is the best I could do capturing this. I didn't draw these, by the way. Renee found some drawings somewhere. So everyone here has a unique context where they encounter people who are not yet disciples of Jesus. Okay, they're unique neighborhoods or workplaces. They're unique families and unique friend groups. There's people they're praying for, just like that gathering of missionaries. And they're longing for people to know the gospel. But what happens here, at times, this group of people is going to invite their missionary family to go out, to enter into the lives of people that we are individually on mission to. More members of this community are going to seek to know the people in my individual life. More members of the community are going to seek to pray for them. And it is more than just one member of the community that eventually invites them into the church or invites them into a gospel community. Other members of the community come to love and long for these people to know Christ. So if you get nothing else out of this talk about missional momentum, right? Your community is going to grow. That's a mark of health. But if you get nothing else out of this, invite one another into your relationships. Invite one another. And if you, as you have the opportunity to be invited into those relationships of people outside the church, step into that. Go out to dinner. Have barbecues. Have people over, have people from your workplace, your neighborhood, have them into your home, and people from your GC step into that. Michelle and I can tell you countless stories of people who would come into our house, of people from our church and people from outside our church, and they would just, in that setting, naturally ask questions. How do you guys know Paul and Michelle? Oh, we go to church with them. Creates an easy segue to talk about what it means to invite people into those spaces. One of my favorite stories about Seeds of the Gospel that have played out this way. some of you guys may know Greg and Larissa Dow. By way of the Air Force, they found themselves away from their homes in Bellevue, Nebraska. So Larissa had been raised in a Roman Catholic home, but the gospel never took root in her life. Greg had a grandfather who pointed him to the gospel, but it never took root either. Military spouses in our church, they often connect one another, and in this case, Brittany Steigner, a woman who was a member of our gospel community, over the long period of time. She invited others to get to know Larissa in particular. She eventually invited Larissa into our church and to care for her. And a few years ago, we had the opportunity to baptize her. She cried. I cried. It was one of my favorite days in the history of our church. But here's the thing. Her being converted to Christianity, that was not the stopping point. It was not the end goal. Because now we came to a point where we longed for her neighbors. And she would have one of my kids, she invited them to watch these neighbors of hers, their family. They were agnostic. She would have one of my kids watch their kids, which created more context for conversation. We would do birthday parties with them. And at the time, Larissa's husband was very much still identifying as a non-Christian as well. So Greg wouldn't come to our gatherings, but he would allow us, if we wanted to do a gospel community barbecue at their house, he'd be like, yeah, let's do that. So we could build relationships with Greg that way. Or if we were if we were doing something to celebrate somebody in our gospel community, like, hey, we're going to do this celebration. Would Greg be up for us hosting, for you guys hosting? Yep, Greg's up for that. So we would go into their space and we would rub shoulders with Greg. And so just what Ian said earlier, this sense of all people will know you're my disciples by the love you have for one another, Greg was encountering Christian community. And that story in many ways is still being written, but Greg is in a much different place than he was a few years ago as far as his connection to learning about Christ, being in the church. And so those are the type of relationships we're talking about. How we enter into one another's lives and then invite them into our gospel communities, invite them into our church. Missional momentum means we're entering into one another's lives, looking for opportunities. We're going to talk more about this tomorrow during my breakout session. But ultimately, a community centered on Christ, it can't help but long to share the gospel with others, to see friends and family and coworkers come in, so it will swell.